The more that we can build in that functional movement and that aerobic exercise and the strength training without going to extremes, then we're setting ourselves up for the next 20 years. If we take a life course approach to looking after ourselves, I wish I had known what I know now at 45, because I would have really changed my lifestyle. Forget about HRT, forget about all the chemical stuff. The number one thing that throws our hormones out is stress. Second thing that throws our hormones out is lack of sleep.
This is the Transformational Life Consulting Podcast with Deepa Grandin, MD, where Christians like you get the practical support and tools you need to build your spiritual, mental, and physical well-being, and to guide you on your journey to health and wholeness based on evidence-based science and God's Word. I am your host, Dr. Deepa Grandin. Thank you to all our regular listeners for taking the time to listen to yet another episode of Time to Transform. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to our first-time listeners. We hope you find the information provided useful and will continue to make Time to Transform part of your spiritual health and wellness journey. All right, so let's get to today's episode. We will focus on understanding the physiology of menopause and the transformative power of lifestyle choices, and addressing some of the physical and emotional challenges accompanying the stage of a woman's life. So let's try to understand what exactly is menopause. So menopause is a point in time when a woman has gone 12 consecutive months without a menstrual period. It happens on average at age 52. It's a natural process that occurs when the ovaries stop producing reproductive hormones. And menopause can also happen due to surgery or medical treatment. And in these situations, we call it induced menopause. Hormonal changes due to menopause can cause uncomfortable physical and emotional symptoms. Treatments such as hormone therapy, medication, or lifestyle adjustments are available to help with these symptoms. However, since we are more of a lifestyle-focused podcast, our podcast today will focus mainly on trying first to understand the science behind why do women, once they reach menopause, have these symptoms, and what exactly is the role of lifestyle choices in helping women when they're in this stage of life deal with some of those physical and emotional symptoms that can be quite uncomfortable. Today, I'm so very fortunate to have Dr. Wendy Sweet, all the way from New Zealand, joining us to help us discuss this very critical topic. So Dr. Sweet's original career was, she was an ICU nurse. She then retrained and helped pioneer the personal training industry in New Zealand. She became a lecturer in the Health, Sports, and Human Performance Department at the University of Waikato. During this time, she became curious about how women perceived their aging and the role of exercise during their menopause transition. And then she decided to take her PhD in this area. Dr. Sweet, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Can you take some time to tell us a little bit about yourself? What caused you to transition from being an ICU nurse to a lecturer in the Health, Sports, and Human Performance Department, and now to have a PhD in women's health and aging?
Well, kia ora koutou, all the way from New Zealand, Deepa. That's a beautiful Māori greeting, our Indigenous people's greeting, and it means welcome, everybody. So welcome to your listeners, as it's quite a journey that I've been on, like many women and academics, and my journey, as you say, started with nursing, but back in those days, it was in the 1980s and early 1990s. There was a real change in the physical landscape in many countries, particularly America, and certainly here in New Zealand and across in Australia as well. So there was a burgeoning fitness industry. And back in those days, of course, we were all following on from Jane Fonda and Jazzercise. So I was not only working as a nurse, but then kind of relocating down to the health centre, the fitness centre, and teaching aerobics, we called back in those days. And I did that for a number of years. And whilst I was doing that, I decided to retrain in physical education. And then I relocated from the South Island of New Zealand to the North Island and set up. It was back in the early 1990s, and as I say, the physical landscape was changing for women. And I was working. I started off the personal training side of things for global fitness giant Les Mills. So that kind of got me into the fitness industry, and I did that for nearly 20 years. But then what happened? We relocated, and back in those days, I was setting up a lot of education for here in New Zealand, and that education was to do with exercise and certainly lifestyle change and certainly behaviour change, as you can appreciate. And back in those days, I was also doing a lot of resource development for the education industry. And I travelled up to America to a big education conference. There was the American College of Sports Medicine, the American Council on Exercise, and a whole lot of universities. And it was really the start of, this is probably the late 1990s. It was the start of understanding how we bring careers into exercise, the exercise industry. And it was at that conference that I had had been doing my master's in lifestyle behaviour change. And it was at that conference that the head of Curves International, a gym chain in America and throughout Canada, and she said, I don't know what's happening, but women between the ages of 50 and 55 are the highest demographic to join our health clubs. And then she paused and she said, but they're the first to leave. Mm-hmm. And it was fascinating because I had noticed the same here in New Zealand. There was a lot of midlife women who were coming into the health clubs and then they were leaving. You know, they weren't adhering. And I had been talking to my supervisor. I'd finished my master's, talked to my supervisor when I came back, and I said, I heard this very, really curious comment, and I think the same thing is happening here in New Zealand. I know I've heard it in Australia as well. And he said to me, well, why don't you go out and talk to women and find out? That will be a great PhD topic. So I spent the next few years interviewing women around New Zealand, the length of New Zealand, and every single one of them had been doing exercise for a number of years. Now, I'm in my 60s now, but we are the first generation, and a lot of American women will relate to this. We're the first generation to come through the fitness industry. Our mothers, you know, didn't do that. And so I was talking to women and they were telling me how they had positioned healthy aging. All these women were between 50 and 60 years old, and they had positioned their healthy aging in doing a lot of exercise. And when I said why, every single one of them, not one of them knew each other, every single one of them said, because I don't want to age like my mother. Yeah. And then when I said to them, well, how is all this exercise going for you? They were doing CrossFit. They were doing, you know, all sorts of classes and heavy strength training and everything. And then the stories unfolded. And those stories were about, I can't sleep. I'm having more hot flashes. My legs and joints are so sore. My muscles are sore. And I thought, wow, this is fascinating, because not one of them mentioned menopause. Mm. And so they weren't relating their symptoms to the stage of life that they were in. Yeah. And that was really the start for me of really, diving deeper into this particular demographic, women who are in their midlife years, 45 to 60, those years whereby we are transitioning through the change, and we don't know how to look after ourselves. We don't know how to take care of ourselves. This was 10 years ago. That is changing, fortunately. But it was certainly when I first started, there wasn't a lot of information for women about how to exercise, what type of exercise, what sort of nutrition, how do they adjust to this next stage of life where, as as I often say, we're stepping into those post-menopause years. It's this transition into our post-menopause years. So there's a lot of physiological changes going on, not just hormonal changes, but physiological changes. So that's what I've been working on for 10 years now, and I've set up programs that help women and support women to make the right changes, and not just focused on hormonal balance, but aging.
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear you say this, because my whole lifestyle transformation started after my first child was born. And then, I was in my late 20s. And like you had mentioned, the first thing that came to my mind, because I'd gained so much weight, I had complications in my pregnancy. I had to go on bed rest and gained a ton of weight. And I couldn't recognize myself. And, while you're pregnant, you're dealing on the complications of your pregnancy. And after your baby is born, that's when it hits you like, oh my gosh, who is this woman I'm looking at in the mirror? And so, like you were talking about, I did start working out more, focusing on what I was eating. And I actually feel like now, like 20 years later, I feel more fit now than I was then, by just following the simple rules of what, as a physician, yes, I used to always preach to my hypertensive diabetes patients. I've also listened to your masterclass on menopause and the power of the Mediterranean diet, which I now eat a lot more of. But even during these 20 years of transition, I have seen how it's not, I can stay at this one place. I have to keep evolving based on the stage of life. But because the transition was so gradual, I feel like I work out more effectively, or, I've been able to run marathons and do long distance running, something I could never do in my early 20s. I'm able to do it now. Mainly because of how I was able to transition over time. So it's like amazing how your body is so resilient, and it's almost like it just learns from the gradual addition of stress and strain on those joints. And I mean, I remember this one time I had so much pain, I had to get an MRI of my knees, and the orthopedic doctor was like, "Wow, your knees look amazing." And you always hear running is terrible for your knees, but I was shocked at, how healthy the ligaments and the cartilage from just
running is great for your knees.
Yeah.
Yeah. And but it's interesting what you say, Deepa, about the progressive change, because there's a lot of women who are now in their 50s and early 60s, and they've been doing the same type of exercise for so long, and but now they're coming into, menopause and post-menopause, and it's very hard for them to change the emphasis on, on the type of exercise they're doing. And there's a lot of confusion out there as well, I think, about the type of exercise. So, for example, there's a lot of, here in New Zealand, and I know it's the same in America, there's a lot of emphasis on heavy weight training for bone density and muscle density. But that's, as you know, as a physician, that the number one concern for all Western women is heart disease. So, as you say, where is the aerobic activity? Where is the jogging? and the marathon running and stuff. So I'm a great, I follow the science, and I'm a great advocate of aerobic exercise. In terms of that, as well as some weight training, but not as much as many women believe that they need to do. Well,
Yeah, I totally. And I was actually really excited to hear you say that in your masterclass about the importance of aerobics, because sarcopenia is also something, women and men face. Once you cross the age of 35, you start losing muscle volume. And so there definitely is place for resistance workout to building that muscle volume. And a lot of the research done on insulin resistance in type 2 diabetes, the larger your muscle volume, the lesser the insulin resistance is. So I totally agree with you as far as having that balance, because a lot of us tend to ditch the aerobics, saying that, hey, this is, I need to focus on just muscle volume and muscle building, which is very crucial. But I totally agree with you, especially with that blood pressure attribution from the lower hormones, which you allude to in your talk about, the hot flashes is actually a reflection of hypertension as time goes on. So and for me personally, because both my parents had hypertension, and by God's grace and by doing regular running, because I run probably out of 7 days, 5 days a week. And I've never had to take blood pressure medications. And that's, to me, it's been miraculous, just doing those lifestyle changes. And specifically, I attribute that to running.
Yes, absolutely. And putting on my physiology hat and my exercise physiology hat, what women don't understand is those, as you say, those attributes of jogging, if they can, even fast walking, power walking is really great. Cycling, swimming. I'm a great believer in women swimming, because when they're prone in the water, if they're good swimmers, if they're prone in the water, then that helps to reduce blood pressure and improve the lymphatic system. But what I was going to say was that it's the aerobic exercise that actually helps in type 2 diabetes as well, because now they've found with type 2 diabetes, it's about managing the fat in the liver, and certainly the fat that's in between the muscles. So having that combination of both is really, really powerful. And what aerobic exercise does. So what I'm talking about with aerobic exercise for your listeners is a minimum of 30 minutes, ideally 60 minutes, and it's steady state. So it's doing something that you can sustain at a moderate pace. You don't need to be out of breath, but a moderate pace, and you can sustain that. And I think many women, our age, between, 40s, 50s, 60s, we've grown up understanding health promotion, and therefore we understand that we've got to exercise, but it's become very confusing about what type of exercise to do. And you can see the growth of Pilates and yoga and cycling studios and CrossFit and all of these different modalities. And I think we're really forgetting the basics. And the basics are, to me, and the more I've been engaging in women's health and aging, the basics is that by the time we're 70 and 80, we've got to walk properly. Hopefully we haven't had the hip replacement and the knee replacement and everything else. So we've got to be able to walk, ideally if we can still run, and we've got to be strong enough to get ourselves up if we fall and get ourselves out of chairs and have this functional movement. So the more that we can build in that functional movement and that aerobic exercise and the strength training without going to extremes, then we're setting ourselves up for the next 20 years. And that's what I really like women to think about and focus on. And if that means doing a mix of different types of exercise, and that's fantastic, because what that does is that wakes up the nervous system. when we're doing a lot of different movement patterns, yoga, Pilates, cycling, swimming, jogging, a little bit of weight training. When we're doing those different movement patterns, we're waking up the nervous system, and that is really good for the brain fog and memory and preventing dementia and Alzheimer's. But then we're also, what's not talked about is with aerobic exercise is increased capillarization. So we can actually open up these blood vessels that deliver oxygen to the muscles and to organs with exercise. So, it's not just about exercise, but it's certainly finding the right type of exercise. And that what that increased capillarization does is also help with the mitochondria. And I know you've got a question about
I
the
was actually going to say that.
So it might be a nice segue into it.
Yeah, totally. So, Dr. Sweet, I often ask my podcast listeners or those who have attended my webinars to send me questions they would like me to answer on my podcast. So this question would be ideal for me to pose to you. It is from a longtime listener, Charlene. She would like to know why, ever since she turned 40, she feels like her body is falling apart and she struggles with low energy. Can you help us understand the physiology behind that?
Sure. Hi, Charlene. And can I first say, Charlene, that if you're struggling with low energy at 40, you're not alone. It's perhaps fatigue and, low energy is perhaps the number one issue I get. And I wish I knew all this at 40 and instead of in my 50s. So essentially, I always start broadly, and the broad topic is the busyness of woman, how busy we are and what we've got going on in our lives. And, there's enough academic research now to show that as modern women living in a modern Western society, there's a lot going on in our lives. We might be parenting with children. We might have elderly parents that we're looking after. We might be holding down one or two jobs. And of course, there's everything that's going on in the home as well. So I think the first thing is to just take a breath and say, and do some reflection on, wow, what is using up my energy? And then we're, coming back to exercise. A lot of women are also trying to fit in the exercise and everything else. So that's the first thing that I often say is from a societal perspective, we are exhausted. But the next thing I say is what if women could understand that throughout their life, if you look at the different phases of life where the hormones become chaotic, we've got puberty. And then if women have been pregnant, we've got pregnancy or pregnancies, plural. And then, of course, we've got this transition in our 40s and into our 50s, now through the next phase. So the hormones are constantly adjusting. So that in itself causes fatigue. If women are still menstruating, then that can be a cause of fatigue. So I always say to women, what is your iron and your ferritin doing? Now, those are blood markers that iron, for example, is really important because it helps to carry oxygen. It binds to the red blood cells and carries oxygen around the body. So if women are feeling the fatigue, the chronic fatigue that they can't get on top of, then what is going on with those iron levels? And I think a lot of women from a dietary perspective have moved off red meat, which is fantastic because we do want a plant-based, as much as possible, a plant-based diet to reduce inflammation, particularly as we get older. But there's some women who are exercising that actually need to think about, well, where am I getting my iron from? Where am I getting my vitamin B12 from? those are the nutrients that help to give you energy. So that's one aspect. And then, of course, we've got other causes of low energy, which is not sleeping. That's a big one for many women, particularly as they come into menopause. And we've certainly got how much food women are getting. We get energy from the food we eat. And so we want good quality food that is going to help to maintain our blood glucose. And I think there's so much emphasis on these days. Well, we all know that there's so much emphasis on how we look and our weight and everything else. And there's a lot of emphasis these days on fasting. Yeah. And that has its place. Caloric restriction has its place in healthy aging and certainly weight loss. However, for women who are chronically fatigued, if they're not eating enough for what energy they're expending, they're going to become fatigued. And it's exactly the same as female athletes. And this is what got me into understanding fatigue and chronic fatigue, was understanding that in our younger female athletes, we've known this for years, that there's overtraining syndrome or chronic fatigue syndrome, which is now called RED-S, or reduced energy deficiency syndrome. And that means essentially that there's a lot of energy going out, but not enough coming in. And I see that all the time with women on my programs. They've got a lot going on. They're doing a lot of exercise. They're not eating the right foods. They've come off iron-rich foods and B12-rich foods. Yeah. And they're wondering why they're dropping down into this fatigue. Sure. So, Charlene, I hope that it's not just one thing.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so you've touched upon, the importance of sleep, the importance of types of food, because we know that animal products, especially if you're eating lean meats, fish, they're good sources of B12. Even lean beef is a good source of iron and B12. So you don't have to completely eliminate it. You can do a flexitarian type diet where 80% of your source of protein and energy comes from plant-based, and you can still have some amount of
I agree. And I think deeper, my message is, what stage of life are you in? And as you mentioned earlier, if we take a life course approach to looking after ourselves, then, when you're 40, it's really great to eat these foods if you're still menstruating. But by the time you're 50 or 52, when your menstruation stops, then you can start to change your diet again. Yes. So just talking about iron, we need around 12 milligrams of iron when we're menstruating. But when we're not menstruating, as we've come through menopause, we only need 8 milligrams of iron. And I don't think those messages are really getting out about making women aware of just thinking about, well, what stage of menopause am I in, and what stage of life am I in? And, am I exercising? Am I not exercising? Am I more sedentary? All those factors are really important.
True, very true. So how does menopause impact our mitochondria? So you had very, aptly talked about how aerobic exercises increase the mitochondria, I'm sure in size and population, because that is the powerhouse. And the more you use your muscles, your body just naturally tends to deflect in that direction. And so how does that affect our overall health?
Well, just going back to the mitochondria, I love the mitochondria, and this, it answered so many questions to me personally when my muscles became really sore. And I'm like you, Deepa, I've been exercising, all my life. And when I hit my late 40s, early 50s, I didn't understand the changes in my muscles. And I'm not just talking about skeletal muscles.
Yeah.
We've got smooth muscle inside our blood vessels and our organs, and we've got cardiac muscle. And I'm such an advocate for women looking after their heart. So the mitochondria, the little organelles that are inside the cell, and this is where energy is made. And as we move through menopause and the hormones change, so estrogen and progesterone is declining, but we've also got the master hormones, the pituitary hormones declining as well. And what that does and is certainly affect changes around the body. There's such a focus on just the hormones as women come through menopause. However, the body is aging, and I hate to remind women of that word because we live in such an anti-aging and youthful society. But internally, as you well know, Deepa, from being a medical physician, internally we're aging, we're getting older. The blood vessels are getting older, the organs are getting older, and so the cells are changing in that we're also accumulating inflammation. And there's a new term for your listeners, if they haven't heard of it. It's called inflammaging.
Right.
And this starts from 45 on. So right when women are coming through menopause, we're getting inflammatory changes deep inside our cells and tissues. Now, this also is influenced through the life course. So if women have been smoking, if they've been drinking heavily, if they've had a lot of fast food, high fat food, all of the vices that a lot of sugar over our time, a lot of processed food, then those inflammatory changes can accelerate. So within the mitochondria, they're becoming inflamed as well. And that impacts the nutrients that need to pass into the mitochondria that help to make energy. And those are definitely glucose and our fats that help to make energy. And it's also some of the B vitamins, and it's also CoQ10. So these, as we get older and we come into our menopause transition, the mitochondria that are in the cardiac muscle, the smooth muscle, and skeletal muscle are aging. And there's just these inflammatory changes going on. So we have to look after them. We have to look after our mitochondria to have more energy as we get older. And the way to do this is to start thinking about how do I reduce the rate of inflammaging? Right. We can't stop aging, can we? None of us can stop aging. We can, have Botox and everything else, but we can't. And what we're trying to do is slow down the rapid rate of aging.
Yeah.
So that's what we need to do, is look after our mitochondria.
Yeah, nicely said. So what essential lifestyle changes do you recommend for premenopausal, menopausal, and postmenopausal women to combat the consequences of, the low hormone levels and the inflammaging?
Can I just congratulate you for having those 3 phases? Menopause gets thrown in. We're all thrown into the same basket. I'm well into post-menopause now. But there are definitely these 3 phases. And from, when we're looking at normal, natural menopause, so forget about surgical menopause, forget about medical menopause. So the normal menopause is when, as you mentioned right at the beginning, Deepa, that we're going into this ovarian decline. So somewhere between midlife. So 45 is round about midlife for most Western women. And we're in midlife when we are halfway through the average life expectancy of the country you live in, because that differs around the world, obviously. So here in New Zealand, European woman, round about 85 is our average age, our life expectancy. But for Māori women, it's only 82. So somewhere around our mid-40s is when we reach midlife. And it's, it's genetically programmed. There are differences between certainly if you had a late puberty, if you have had late pregnancies, all those sorts of things can affect when you go into perimenopause. So perimenopause is when there is some change to your menstrual cycles. You might, have a heavy menstrual cycle. You might have a light one. It might stop, it start, all sorts of things. And there are changes going on around the body. Menopause, as you mentioned right at the start, is when your periods cease. And when and then once we've had no periods for a year, then we go into postmenopause, where we are going to stay for the rest of our life. So those three distinct phases. And I, as I say, I wish I had known what I know now at 45, because I would have really changed my lifestyle. Forget about HRT, forget about all the chemical stuff and all the supplements. Nothing wrong with that, but it's the lifestyle. Right. And the first thing I think I would have done is really understood the benefit of sleep, of not, we all do it, no matter where women are in the world. And I know this from women on my program. You're busy, you're trying to do everything in the home, you put the kids to bed, and then you might get out your own work. You put out your laptop and you might be working into the evening when the house is quiet. Or there's things going on in the home that you've got to deal with. So sleep is the foundation. I cannot reiterate that enough. Our entire body works on a circadian rhythm, and I'm sure you've talked about this in your own work that you do. But understanding that the hormones, the adjustment to the hormones in perimenopause, as they start to change, we've got to start with sleep. And then with perimenopause, I'd be really focusing on making adjustments to diet and getting blood work done. Yeah. There are so many changes to vitamin D. We've already talked about iron and B12, ferritin, which is your storage form of iron, and then another one which your listeners may not have heard of is CRP, C-reactive protein. Because what we know from the research is that when women move from perimenopause, so they're in perimenopause usually from 45 years old right through to 52. Yeah. Throughout those years, perimenopause is now known as an inflammatory part of the life course. So there's changes going on in the liver, there's changes going on in the muscles, there's changes going on around the body. So it's not just about these hormones, and the thyroid is really important. And then when we reach menopause, we start to, again, sleep is really important. But now we're not menstruating. So now we really need to start to think about how do we start to bring this anti-inflammatory diet and the Mediterranean diet. How can we change our exercise? Whether, as I say, whether women have decided to go on HRT or not with their physician, but how do we now start to make adjustments in our lifestyle? And I still think that the number one concern for many younger women, younger than me, of course, but they're, as I say, Charlene, you're 40 and there'll be some of you that are 45 in your 40s, thinking about how stressed and overwhelmed you feel. Because the number one thing that throws our hormones out is stress. The second thing that throws our hormones out is lack of sleep. Right. We can go without food for a few days. We can't go without water, but stress and lack of sleep for the modern woman are the two issues that we need to get on top of, because stress throws out this axis that we've got, the hormones that talk to each other, from the pituitary, the hypothalamus, the pituitary hormones, the thyroid, the parathyroid, which helps with calcium regulation in the body, and then, of course, the adrenals, which are your stress hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine, and ovaries. All of those hormones work through this axis. If I held a plumb, a builder's plumb line, a bit of string from the brain right down the middle of your body, you've got this hormonal and nerve axis, neural axis, and that's what gets out of balance. So the sleep, the stress management, and nutrition, and not too much exercise if you're not sleeping.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you had mentioned about the coenzyme Q10. How does coenzyme Q10 improve menopausal symptoms?
Well, coenzyme Q10, I first came across this when it was at that conference that I went to in America all those years ago. And I actually heard the late Dr. Stephen Sinatra talking, a cardiologist. And interestingly, I had noticed that I was starting to get some palpitations. Some of your listeners may, they may have experienced some palpitations, breathlessness on exercise, and kind of the feeling that your blood pressure goes up, is up, and that can impact hot flashes. And I had been to my own doctor, my general practitioner here in New Zealand, and I said to her, I'm having palpitations. I can feel that I'm having these, these changes in rhythm. Now, I've worked in coronary care, in the coronary care unit, so I was totally freaked out. And she said, well, that's interesting, because I get a lot of women who come to me and they tell me the same thing, and they all go and get checked out by their cardiologist, but nothing, they don't find anything. So I duly went to, the cardiologist and got checked out. Again, not a problem. And it was fascinating, because when I was in America, there was Dr. Stephen Sinatra, who has pioneered a lot of work in CoQ10, talking about this CoQ10, which I had, even though I had worked, in coronary care and intensive care, I had never, ever heard of it before. I didn't even know about it from my exercise sports science. But CoQ10 is a compound that we need to help in the mitochondria. So it passes through the membrane wall, and as a normal part of aging, it starts to decline. And of course, it's in the cardiac muscle, and it's also in our skeletal muscle. So this compound, CoQ10, passes through into the mitochondria, where oxygen is stored, and it helps to make ATP, our energy molecule. And I saw the diagrams that Dr. Sinatra was putting on, and he said, we know in women, once they reach their early 50s, and men, that they haven't, that this CoQ10 starts to decline. And I thought, wow, this is fascinating. So I read a lot of the research, and it's a discovery that was made in Japan. And certainly I bought a CoQ10 supplement. Some of the doses are quite high, but, women don't need those high doses. And if they're on cardiac medication, then always get that checked out with your doctor. But the heart is aging, and the cardiac muscle is aging. It's starting to atrophy a little bit. No matter if we're runners or jumpers or whatever. But we're getting these changes to the muscles, and it's these changes to the cardiac muscle, the skeletal muscle, that again cause this inflammation. So that's where the CoQ10 comes in, as part of not necessarily due to menopause, but as part of just this general transition that we move through into post-menopause.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for sharing that. And so, in your masterclass on menopause, you mentioned that women of the Hadza tribe in Tanzania reach menopause at the age of 41. And that's like almost 10 years earlier than their Western counterparts. Why is that the case? And is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, it's fascinating. And for your listeners, the masterclass on menopause, it's a two-part, they're 1 hour each. It's on the website, My Menopause Transformation. And I talk about Dr. Katie Fitzpatrick. She wasn't Dr. Katie Fitzpatrick then. She's from the United Kingdom. I don't know how she did this, but for 2 years she went down to Africa and she lived with a woman in Tanzania, the Hadza woman, and she was studying the menstrual cycles and menopause of these traditional women. And she was with a team from a university in the United Kingdom, and they were doing a lot of blood markers and, looking at how they lived. And she was specifically interested in the menstrual cycles, and I was fascinated. It's one of the very few PhDs that I've got sitting on my laptop, but I was fascinated when I read it because she had lived with these Hadza women, and she had mentioned that they're tribal, obviously, so they're foraging for food. They eat on average 3,000 calories a day. The older woman, the woman in post-menopause, helped to look after the younger woman and their children, and the average duration of their menstruation was 2 days. And within those 2 days, the woman rested. So they didn't go and walk. They were walking on average 6 to 8 kilometres a day. But when they had their menstruation, they stayed close to the village, and they really didn't, do that extended walk. And I thought, gosh, how many Western women would rest but while they had their periods? That was fascinating. And then she also said that the average age that the woman's periods ended was 41 years old. And she countered that by saying that they were generally, the average age of pregnancy was 17, and the average age of their first period was 11 years old. So when you take a life course approach, then there's still, plus they had a different diet and everything else, but when you take a life course approach, they're having children a lot earlier, and they're finishing their reproductive cycle a lot earlier as well. So 41, 42 was the average age that they went into menopause. Now, your question was, is that a good thing? Well, I don't know, because it depends on the life expectancy of the Hadza tribal woman. Yeah. And there's a general thought, well, this is the purpose of HRT, isn't it? Hormone Replacement Therapy, is that if we can keep estrogen in the body for longer and produce some progesterone, then that is anti-inflammatory. That helps to, slow down the rate of aging. And of course, these women weren't having any hormone replacement therapy at all, but they were going into an early menopause. But they had quite a different lifestyle. And what I picked up deeper in this PhD was the fact that every single day they were walking 6 to 8 kilometres to forage for food. They were stopping, talking, chatting. They were eating a lot of tubers of starch food, so digging under the ground. They were eating seeds and berries. They weren't having a lot of meat. Obviously, the men had to go out and hunt for the meat. They might eat meat once a week. But they were also walking in bare feet, so they were doing a lot of grounding. And we know now that walking in bare feet for 15 to 20 minutes a day is all part of this anti-inflammatory, part of what we can do to reduce inflammation and reduce blood pressure. And it was interesting when I looked at this PhD and I looked at the data that came out of it, then blood pressures were normal. Even in the postmenopause woman, they were a lot lower than the average blood pressure of women living in Western societies. And certainly the food, 3,000 calories a day, and it was plant-based food. So quite a different lifestyle. But I was really fascinated reading that about how they did go into early menopause. But I'm not sure. I can't quite remember what the life expectancy was and if they still have that same post-menopause life, number of years.
Sure. Yeah, I think that makes sense because, like, when you had initially spoken about, based on your society depends on what's going on around you, because so much about the biome that you live in influences how your body, including the hormones, function. So that makes total sense.
It was interesting with that, with the Hadza tribal woman, that she asked them about all the different symptoms of menopause. They didn't get any. All they talked about was some vaginal dryness. That's it. They didn't have a word for hot flashes. They didn't know what that was. They didn't have the sore joints, and of course they're walking in bare feet. They're out in the sun. Vitamin D. That's another. That's another area of mine that I'm very passionate about.
Yeah. Very fascinating indeed. So, why is IBS or irritable bowel syndrome more common in women in their 50s?
Again, if we look at the fact that it's well known that irritable bowel syndrome, or IBS, is 4 times more prevalent in women over the age of 50 than younger women, and certainly men. I have, if your listeners want to go to my website, I've got a menopause symptoms quiz on that website. And I've had over 500,000 women fill in that symptoms quiz. And we did some big data analysis last year. And there was 73% of 500,000 women. And I advertised the symptoms quiz in New Zealand, Australia, the United Kingdom, Ireland, Canada, America. So that's the majority of women who do the symptoms quiz. Over 70% of them say that they get IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. And I was quite fascinated with this, and it keeps coming up all the time in my program. So I decided to do some digging into it. And certainly Professor Rosemary Stanton in Australia, she's been a nutritionist for 30 years. I talk about her in the masterclass, and she talks about the changing gut microbiome. So, all the bacteria and viruses, and the health of the microbiome has changed enormously over our lifetime. So over the last 40 years, because of the change in the food environment, because of processed food and high sugar food and high fat food and high protein, animal protein as well. So there's been this change in the microbiome. But the other thing now, with the next layer for women as they come from perimenopause to menopause, where there's another inflammatory shift as women go into menopause, then what happens is the tiny little, as estrogen now starts to decline even more, even for women on hormone replacement therapy, but as we get another shift in the aging of our gut, the tiny little microvilli that are along the gut wall, they start to come apart a little bit. And they start to come apart because estrogen helps to hold them together, but also zinc helps to hold them together, and vitamin D. So these are the nutrients that we need to focus on. So as women come into menopause, they've got the changing food environment. They've got stress, which impacts the gut and the microbiome. They've got changing levels of vitamin D, which impact the gut. They may be low in zinc, which helps those little microvilli to bind and adhere. Plus, if you think about the fact that as we go from our 50s into post-menopause, 52, 53, the peristalsis, so the movement of the gut, the way the gut moves, it starts to slow down. And, there's a woman, if they have been used to eating a lot of food, then they need to cut back some of the volume of that food and leave time between each meal. Yeah. And I think we are a society where we do eat a lot. There's a lot of food. There's always food available. Yeah. So we just need to slow down with our eating, and just understand that the peristalsis, the gut motility, is starting to slow down. If women aren't sleeping, the gut is on a 24-hour circadian rhythm. Yeah. So again, that can impact the inflammation in the gut. So there's a number of reasons that are really pertinent to women, and irritable bowel syndrome, which is an inflammatory disease of the gut. And so these things are really important to start to think about, not only the type of food we eat, but how much food we eat, when we're eating, and just trying to understand that if we can get the gut is really powerful now, as you all know, Deepa, because we know that there's messages that go between the gut and the brain. Yeah. So if women are concerned about brain fog, memory problems, then start by looking at the gut. And again, coming back to sleep, that's really important. I do a lot of traveling. I travel. Being down in New Zealand, you're forced to spend many, many hours in planes, as you do as well, with going to Abu Dhabi. But the first thing I do is really focus on my gut health. When I'm doing these big 17-hour flights up to Dubai and then on to Europe or the UK, I really, for that whole week, to reduce the jet lag, I really focus on my gut health and get it back onto that circadian rhythm. So sleep becomes important, and the types of foods that we're eating, the fibre is really, really important.
Oh, lots of great advice there. So a very much related question, because the gut microbiome is so important and the gut health is so important, but somehow, like you were talking about, the microvilli changing its structure thanks to the hormonal changes. How does the gut changes that happen during menopause further impact mental health?
That's a great question, and I wish I had another hour. But I might have to come back and just do and talk about. I really think it's tough for women because we come into menopause, and I know this myself. I remember the changes in our mood and the changes in. It's not so much anxiety, but it's the feeling that you're not coping the way you've been coping for the last 20, 30 years. And I think that's really, really tough for so many women. And really what we have to understand that it is a vulnerable time for mental health. So just give yourself a break. It's just acknowledge that it is a time of our life whereby we do experience changes with our mood and with anxiety and even melancholy and depression. So that's the first acknowledgement. The second thing is, I'm a physiologist, so I always think about the why, and my poor doctor, she was long suffering. She's since done my programs in the masterclass, because I used to go in and say, Marilyn, I've been reading these papers, because as I came through menopause, I was doing my PhD,
Yeah.
And I said, I want a vitamin D test. And she said, why? I said, because my moods are all over the place and the skin is changing so much as we come through menopause that it impacts vitamin D. And I do a lot of skiing. I'm often in long winters and I need my vitamin D done. She said, oh, it's not something that we do. It's a paid test. I just said, I don't care. Here's my credit card. I want to pay for it. And so she took it and it was low because she wanted to put me on antidepressants. Now, I'm not saying that they don't help women. They certainly
Right.
do.
Right.
But what I hadn't realised was that the skin and you as an immunologist, Deepa, will understand the changing nature of the skin in menopause and the absorption of vitamin D, calcitonin, and then the impact on the small intestine. We need vitamin D to help with calcium uptake in the small intestine. And we also need a type of protein called tryptophan. Now, tryptophan is just a part of our nutrition. It's in turkey, it's in greenish bananas. There's lots of foods that have tryptophan. These foods are needed to help make our mood hormones, dopamine and serotonin. So the pathway, if we've got gut health problems, if we've got low vitamin D and we're not sleeping, we might have gut health problems. If we've got gut health problems, we may not be absorbing calcium, which is needed for nerve regulation and muscle contraction. We forget about that. But also we need this tryptophan to help make serotonin and dopamine and our mood hormones. So it's not just one thing. It's actually the fact that there's lots of things going on that are all interconnected. And I walked into my long-suffering doctor and I said, I don't know what's going on, but I feel like I want to burst into tears all the time. And I remember going from my spin class, with all the endorphins, and then getting in the car driving home, and I felt like bursting into tears. And I said to my doctor, I said, oh, this isn't good. What's going on? And she didn't have an answer except to reach for the prescription pad for antidepressants. And I said, well, hang on a minute. I've never been depressed. I've never had postnatal depression. I've done a lot of exercise where where I keep my endorphins high. But what I realise now, looking back, and so that's when we were talking about the vitamin D and why vitamin D can be low. And of course, we know that can contribute to low moods. But the other thing is the regulation of blood sugar. Here I was doing high intensity exercise and not replacing the foods that I needed to afterwards. So my blood sugar levels were crashing. And I think that this is what women forget, is that we want our blood sugar levels to stay nice and steady throughout the day. So we want low to moderate glycemic index carbohydrates. And we don't want our blood sugar levels crashing. We've all experienced children who don't eat and they get really, they start crying and they get really grumpy. Well, we're the same as we come through menopause because our muscles are changing and when we get this dysregulation of glucose, which can be problematic, especially in women who are overweight. Now, I put on a lot of weight in menopause. I put on probably 15 kilos. I'm not sure what that is in pounds, sorry. But I didn't realize that fat cells attract, this sounds a little bit complicated, but it's not. But fat cells attract vitamin D, which are a fat-soluble hormone. Right. So even though I was outside and going for my runs and everything else, the vitamin D wasn't being used around the body. Does that make sense? It was being stored in the fat cells. And this is a problem with women who are overweight or obese going into menopause. They can be low in circulating vitamin D, which impacts gut health.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially when people who are women, especially in the menopausal, postmenopausal phase, the obesity seems to play such a huge role in that fatigue component. And especially the way you're explaining about how it traps the vitamin D, that really helps explain a lot of that.
Mm. Well,
Yes.
obesity
Yeah.
is fat cells that are enlarged and they're inflamed. So
Yeah.
it's again I wish I could get rid of the word menopause deeper, because menopause is just a stage of life we all go
Right.
through.
Yeah.
But what is changing and what is different between women, whether they're thinner and leaner or whether they're overweight or obese, the difference is the level of inflammation or this inflammaging.
Right.
So I often say, forget about menopause. We all go through it.
Right.
Think
Exactly.
about inflammaging.
Right.
That's the transition you're on. And the faster your rate of inflammation is based on your life history. Are you a smoker? Do you have a healthy liver? Have you been overtraining with exercise? That's a lot of inflammation in the muscles. Have you got a lot of stress? Have you had PTSD? So all of those factors accelerate the rate of aging. Plus, glycated end products, so sugar.
Yeah.
Sugar. Get off the sugar and get off the white flour.
Yeah. Great advice. So I think, for the sake of time, I would love to just sit and chat with you forever because this is such great information. And again, to all my listeners, Dr. Wendy Sweet has her own website, which we will share with you in our share notes. I personally bought her menopause masterclass, and for me personally, got a lot of great tips from a lifestyle perspective. And, we think that lifestyle is like, okay, sleep, eat, nutrition, but it's so much more than that. And so I would encourage you guys to definitely check it out. So, Dr. Sweet, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. Before we conclude, is there anything else you'd like to share with us?
Thank you so much for having me, and to your listeners. I hope you've understood my Kiwi accent. My message to all the listeners is you aren't alone, and keep yourself educated. We get so caught up in the fact that menopause is all about hormone replacement, but as Deepa said, it's about lifestyle change. You're going through the change and it's time to change things up a bit. So keep yourself educated, keep yourself open to ideas, and work out what's right for you. So work with the right people who can really help you. So that's really the encouragement. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sweet, once again. And we hope to have you in further episodes.